everyone, and welcome back to Little Books Great Stories. Today we're going to read Ada Twist Scientist, the Why Files of the Science of Baking. Did you know that baking is really just science? We mix different ingredients, causing them to react and create all sorts of yummy treats like cakes and muffins. I love chocolate cakes. What's your favorite pastry? Now make sure to subscribe to Little Books Great Stories if you haven't already. Hit that bell icon so you're notified for every new video I upload here. Like the video, and let's start reading. Stay through to the end for 2 super cool science experiments. Ada Twist Scientist, the Why Files, the Science of Baking. I made a cake for my dad's birthday. I put in all the right things, but it tasted terrible. Why? It's a mystery, a riddle, a puzzle, a quest. Time to find out what baking is about. Baking is an activity shared by countries all over the world. From bao to baguettes, naan to nut bread, baking plays an important role in all cultures. Did you know that science plays a big part in baking? There are many ways that bakers use science to make the tastiest of treats. Each time you bake, you're conducting a small experiment. What happens if you use too much of this or too little of that? No matter what you decide to bake, you'll probably use some of these common ingredients. Flour, fat, like butter or oil, eggs, liquid, like milk or water, a raising agent, like baking powder, baking soda, or yeast. These ingredients are mixed to make a dough. Not all baked goods use every one of these ingredients. You don't use eggs to make pizza dough, and many cakes can be made without butter or oil. But each of these items has a special and important role in baking. And bakers are always testing new ways of combining them to make yummy goodies. One ingredient in nearly every baked good is flour, and there are many types. Seeds, grains, beans, or nuts are ground up into a fine powder to make flour.
Put me in the blender.
One of the most common types of flour is made from wheat, but bakers often use flour made from almonds, oats, and rice too. Why do bakers use flour? Flour helps give dough its shape. There are proteins in flour that come together to become firm when water or milk is added. Proteins are like building blocks that make things strong. Things like your muscles and dough. The more flour used in a recipe, the firmer the dough will be. Bread recipes use more flour than cake recipes. That is one reason breads are firmer than cakes.
This cake is soft, but this bread is firm.
I have a theory. Bread has the same ingredients as cake, so if I put icing on bread, it will be a cake. Or would it be an icing sandwich? Sugar is another important baking ingredient. It makes baked goods sweet. Yum! But sugar also changes how baked goods feel. Cakes are made of similar amounts of flour and sugar. This makes them soft and moist. Bread recipes only use a little bit of sugar compared to flour. This is another reason bread is firmer than cake. Sugar also makes baked goods turn brown as they cook. Bakers also use fats like butter and oil to keep breads moist and soft. Fats make the firm proteins in flour more stretchy and flexible. They help make bread bouncy.
Stretchy and flexible.
Eggs hold the different ingredients in a recipe together. Just like sugar and fats, they make baked goods moist. Eggs are made of 3 different parts. The egg shell is the outer part of an egg. It protects the inside of the egg from damage. The egg white is clear and is made of mostly water and protein. The egg yolk is yellow and found in the middle of an egg. It is made of mostly fat and protein. Bakers use both egg whites and egg yolks. Sometimes they use each separately, and sometimes they use them together. It all depends on the result they want. Egg yolks add fat and flavor to dough. Since egg whites are mostly water, they can be whipped to create a foam that makes dough light and fluffy. How can you tell if an egg is fresh? If you put an egg in a bowl of water and it sinks and lays on its side, it's fresh. If it floats, it is rotten.
Oh, why am I the rotten egg? You know what you did.
Water and milk are common liquids used in baking. Liquids wet the dry ingredients like flour so they can be mixed. Most bread recipes use water. On the other hand, sweeter baked goods like muffins are often made with milk. Milk has sugars, proteins, and fats that are not in water. The sugars in milk add a bit of sweetness to the dough. The proteins make it stronger. The fats help make sure those strong proteins are still flexible. Muffins taste better when they're soft.
Cake is better goopy.
So how do cakes become fluffy? Baking powder is another important ingredient used to make baked goods. When baking powder mixes with liquid, little air bubbles are created. As those bubbles get bigger, they make the dough get bigger too. This is called rising. The space that air bubbles create in the dough makes it nice and fluffy. A different ingredient called baking soda can also be added to a dough to help it rise. What else do bakers use to help dough rise? Yeast. All about yeast. They are alive. Yeast are living things. Yeast are a fungi, like mushrooms. Yeast are tiny. If you lined them up, it would take about 8,500 yeast to make an inch. They're everywhere. Yeast are in the air, on our skin, and even on trees. Yeast need to eat. One of their favorite foods is sugar. Bakers use yeast to make breads like dinner rolls rise. When you mix dry yeast with liquid and sugar, the yeast begin to eat the sugar. This causes them to release gas, like little yeast burps.
Burp. Mind your manners.
It's alive!
Just as with baking powder and baking soda, those air bubbles make the dough rise. A kind of bread called sourdough uses yeast in a special way. Instead of mixing dry yeast with sugar water, the recipe uses wild yeast. Wild yeast are found naturally in the environment. In fact, the flour you buy at the grocery store has wild yeast in it. When you mix a little bit of flour with water, those wild yeast in the flour begin to grow. After a few days of growing, the mix turns into a sourdough starter. It's like a yeast soup.
Hunting the wild yeast.
But there is more than just yeast in this yeast soup. There are also bacteria. The bacteria in a sourdough starter give bread that taste. That's why it's called sourdough. Even though it is a little sour, it is still very yummy. Yeast is amazing. They create gas bubbles that make bread soft and fluffy. If there were no yeast, how would we get bubbles into bread?
We need a brainstorm. 1. We could use itty-bitty bicycle pumps to push air into the dough. 2. Teeny tiny aliens in the dough could chew bubblegum and blow lots of bubbles. 3. We could capture the bubbles in a bath and squish them into the dough.
It is not an ingredient, but bakers also use heat to make their treats. Most bakers use an oven to heat and cook their baked goods.
Have people always baked bread?
Scientists think the first time that humans used ovens to bake bread was in ancient Syria, over 9,000 years ago.
That bread is 1,000 times older than me. Sweet, Sweet Science by Ada Twist. Measure the sugar, measure the milk. Whip up the batter until it's like silk. Follow the recipe steps one by one. Bake in the oven until it is done. Whether it's cookies or cake that I'm making, I always use science whenever I'm baking.
Bakers mix specific ingredients in a specific order for a very special result. This mixing of ingredients is called a reaction.
Baking soda plus lemon equals bubbles. Lots of baking soda plus lemon equals lots of bubbles.
In science, a reaction is something that makes a change. The mixing of flour and water changes both ingredients into dough. Adding baking powder, baking soda, or yeast to a dough changes it by making it rise. Bakers who study these reactions are called pastry chefs. Humans have been baking for thousands of years, but the first modern-day pastry chef is thought to be Marie-Antoine Carême, who was from France. One of the first baking schools to open in the United States was run by Elizabeth Goodfellow in Philadelphia. She was well known for her pies and cakes and taught classes at her small school for nearly 30 years. Melinda Russell is thought to be the first Black American woman to write a cookbook in the United States. She published her book in 1866. Most of the recipes were for fancy baked desserts. Kimberly Brock Brown is an American pastry chef and became the first Black woman to be included in the American Academy of Chefs.
When I'm baking, I feel like I'm doing science. Am I?
Pastry chefs do a lot of research to make and test each new recipe. They often bake the same thing over and over again. Each time is like an experiment. They make small changes until the final product looks, feels, and tastes exactly how they want. Pastry chefs use different kinds of science for each new creation. Chemistry is the study of chemicals. Sometimes we think of chemicals as bad for us, and many of them are, but our body is full of chemicals that are good for us. So are the foods we eat. Sugar, water, baking powder, and baking soda are all examples of chemicals used in baking. When chemicals mix, it's called a chemical reaction. The chemicals come together to make something new, just like ingredients in a recipe. It is very important for pastry chefs to understand the chemistry of the foods they are using. This helps them choose just the right ones. For example, baking powder, baking soda, and yeast are all used to make dough rise, but they react differently with the other ingredients in a recipe. Yeast take a long time to make dough rise. For faster recipes, like those used to make cookies, pastry chefs will use baking powder or baking soda. These different chemical reactions make baked goods taste different too. A pastry chef will choose one depending on the flavor or texture they want their treat to have.
This cookie was made without baking powder, and this cookie was made with baking powder.
Biology is the study of living things, like yeast. Anytime a pastry chef uses yeast in a recipe, they are making a biological reaction. Yeast, sugar, and water mix to make something new, air bubbles. When a pastry chef uses yeast to make dough rise, they have to be very careful. If they let the dough rise for too long, the yeast will eat all the sugar. When this happens, the final result will not have the right flavor.
Nom nom. Hey, save some for me. Hello, sweetie. Rise and shine.
Physics is the study of how energy and force, a push or pull, affect objects. Pastry chefs use the energy of heat in baking. Heat causes a physical reaction to take place. The dough changes. It becomes more solid. Heat travels from the oven walls to the dough. It moves through the dough by bouncing from air bubble to air bubble. That is how the heat reaches the center. And that's why using baking powder, baking soda, or yeast makes baked goods cook more evenly. Without those bubbles, it is harder for the heat to reach the middle of the dough. Math is also very important for pastry chefs. They need to keep track of time and measure their ingredients very carefully. If a recipe is baked too long, it will burn. If it is baked for too little time, it will be raw. Using too little baking powder will make the dough flat, and using too much liquid will make the dough wet and sticky. Just like scientists, pastry chefs use tools to measure ingredients. They use scales to weigh and special spoons and cups to measure.
Math is important. 2 + 2 = deliciousness. A real-life scientist. Lashita Perry is a baker and she uses science in her job all the time. When she makes baked goods like cookies and cakes, she uses precise measurements of ingredients like baking powder, flour, and butter to make sure her recipes come out just right. I think I've connected the polka dots. Baking is like doing an experiment. If I use the right amount of the right ingredients in the right way, I'll make the best birthday cake for my dad. Awesome possum! Whoever thought science could be so yummy? I have more questions now than I did before. Why does each question lead to 3 questions more? Is answering that what science is for? My questions. Why are some cookies crunchy, but some are chewy? Why do burned cookies taste bad? Do other animals make treats? Could an astronaut make a cake in space? Do yeast eat anything besides sugar? If cake batter includes salt, why doesn't it taste salty? Why do some things taste salty? Why do some things taste sweet? Why do some things taste bitter? Why do people like different kinds of cakes? Simple science experiments. You can ask a grown-up for help. Reactions in action. The materials needed for this science experiment are 2 clear cups, plastic or glass, a half cup of water, a half cup of vinegar, 2 tablespoons of baking soda, and a marker. Here are the instructions. Step 1. Label each cup with water or vinegar. Step 2. Pour the right liquid into each labeled cup. Step 3. Add 1 tablespoon of baking soda into the cup of water. Step 4. Observe. Step 5. Add 1 tablespoon of baking soda into the cup of vinegar. Step 6.
What
Observe.
happened? Did baking soda react the same with water as with vinegar? Did both reactions make bubbles?
Nope. Baking soda needs to be mixed with an acid like vinegar to make bubbles. Share your results on social media using #WhyFilesWonders. Let's try another experiment.
Sugar Cookie Bake-Off. The materials. For this experiment, you will use the following list of materials twice to make 2 separate batches. 1/4 cup butter, which is 1/2 cup total. 1/3 cup sugar, which is 2/3 cups total. 1 egg, which is 2 eggs total. 1/2 tablespoon of vanilla extract, which is 1 tablespoon total. 1 cup all-purpose flour, which is 2 cups total. 1/8 teaspoon of salt, which is 1/4 teaspoon total. 1/8 teaspoon baking powder. Note, you will only use this for 1 batch. Then you'll need a large bowl, electric mixer, parchment paper, rolling pin, 2 baking sheets, oven, use with parental supervision, and cookie cutters or butter knife. Here are the instructions. Step 1. Preheat an oven to 350 degrees Fahrenheit. Step 2. Wash your hands. Batch 1 instructions. Step 1. Soften the butter if needed. Then combine with the sugar in a large bowl using an electric mixer until it becomes creamy. Step 2. Add the egg and vanilla extract. Mix. Step 3. Add your dry ingredients: flour, baking powder, and salt. Step 4. Mix using the electric mixer. When the dough is crumbly, use your hands to mold it into a ball. Step 5. Place the ball in between 2 sheets of parchment paper. Use a rolling pin to roll it out to about 1/4 inch thick. Step 6. Use cookie cutters to cut the dough into shapes. If you don't have cookie cutters, you can use a butter knife to cut the dough into small squares. Batch 2. Repeat the steps, except do not add baking powder to this batch in step 3. Bake. Bake both batches in the oven for 10 minutes. Remove from oven and observe. What do your cookies look like? Does batch 1 look different than batch 2? Did adding baking powder change your result? Share your results on social media using #WhyFilesWonders.